Alrighty, so first thing, a business point. I want to spend the final 10 minutes of class going over what the final 2 classes are going to look like and what assignments you have and all. So if we get to 6:55 and I have not yet talked about the business stuff, can somebody just make sure that I stop and we spend the final 10 minutes talking about that? So I'm just going to write up here, stop me at 6:55 to talk papers and business. So, I mean, I'm going to be keeping my eye on the clock, but just in case, can't hurt to have a few more sets of eyes. So, that out of the way, let's jump in. So, as a reminder, the first half of the class, we were doing more critical thinking stuff, more of the critical thinking side of ethics and critical thinking. And then the last couple classes last couple weeks, we've been looking at the ethics side of ethics and critical thinking. So what did we say that ethics was? Just what was the definition of it? Anyone remember?
It's the study of doing the right thing.
Yeah, it's the study of morality, or the study of doing the right thing, what the right thing to do is in a certain situation. And we started off kind of with more pure philosophical ethics, which was looking at the trolley problem and other sorts of questions in which you look at a particular case, you analyze it, you see what your judgments are on those sorts of cases. Should you press the button to change the direction of the track? Should you not? And why is that the case? And then you can use those general principles about, 5 lives is worth more than 1 life. And then you can use that on future occasions, or try to figure out what the right thing to do is more generally on the basis of those smaller, or on the basis of that single case. And then last week we looked at cultural relativism. And what was cultural relativism? Anyone remember? We talked about it versus moral objectivism. Does anyone remember the distinction between these 2 things, between the cultural relativist position about morality and about the moral objectivist position on morality? Well, I'll give you a clue of what the objectivist position was. The moral objectivist position is the one we generally start with in our common sense, which is this idea that what the right thing to do is the same for everyone, everywhere. There's an objective fact of the matter that holds for everybody in all time. And then that is in contrast to the cultural relativist position. So what did we say cultural relativism was? Anybody? All right. The reminder, the cultural relativist position was this idea that what's right or wrong is not the same for everyone everywhere, but is rather different depending on what culture you're in. So if your culture believes that slavery is okay, then in your culture, relative to your culture, it is the case that slavery is okay. And so last time we discussed what cultural relativism is, and then the Rachel's arguments against it. We discussed 3 of those arguments against it in class. And then there was a bonus video that I posted on, I think, Wednesday, that is now up on the YouTube. So if you didn't get a chance to watch that yet, do that, especially if you're going to be writing on that paper prompt for your 3rd paper. So that's what we've done so far in our ethics. Now, today is going to be our last class in which we talk about these ethical topics. And today we're going to be talking in a more kind of a contemporary issues sort of case, a question that comes up. You'll have read about issues like this in the news, probably. It's something that people discuss online. And what we're going to do is talk about that issue, kind of using the sorts of ethical frameworks and critical thinking that we've used or we've gathered from earlier in the semester. So what is the topic today? Well, the topic today is going to be free speech or freedom of speech. And then also hate speech. So, Mike, your camera just popped on again, or your microphone. So free speech. What is free speech? or freedom of speech. Hopefully you've all heard of this. Is there anyone who's not familiar with this phrase? Or is anyone who's familiar with it? You want to give me what the definition is or what an example of having freedom of speech is?
I feel like it's like the ability to say something or anything based on like just anything.
Yeah, exactly. The idea of freedom of speech. So the technical definition of freedom of speech is the right to express any opinion without censorship or restraint. So, for instance, in the United States, there is a high level of freedom of speech. So what are some things that you're allowed to say that you might not be allowed to say somewhere else that doesn't have freedom of speech? Does anyone have any examples they can think of? Or other times in history, Valerie?
Like criticizing like the president.
Exactly. So in the United States today, you are allowed to criticize your president. You are allowed to say Biden is a terrible person. You can say Biden is a bad president. There are other times in history where you couldn't say this. So for instance, anyone know what would happen if back in like the Middle Ages, you insulted your king? If you said the king is a terrible person and an idiot?
Execution.
Yeah, your head was chopped off. That was that. Usually you'd be tortured first and then you'd get your head chopped off. So this is what the idea of freedom of speech is. Freedom of speech is the ability to say things without being punished for them, or you're allowed to say things without fear that someone in a position of power is going to punish you for it. So if that's the definition, why do we care about it? Or why, generally speaking, especially in the United States, we speak of freedom of speech as a good thing? Why? What is it about freedom of speech that is valuable? There's a few different elements to it.
The freedom part?
Yeah, the freedom part. So, and why is it good to be free? And this is almost one of those so obvious answers that we don't usually stop and think about it. But what are you able to do if you can speak your mind and say what's on your mind?
You can basically say whatever you feel like it. There's no restriction. Nobody can say otherwise to you. You're doing what you're saying what you want.
Yeah, there's a sense in which you can be more, to use like a modern term, you can be more your authentic self if you're allowed to say what's on your mind. You don't have to worry and hold back your words. It's a freeing sort of experience. Human beings don't, like, generally speaking, all of us are in some ways still teenagers who don't like to be told what to do. So in the same way, we don't want to, if we feel something, we want to be able to talk about it. What are some other benefits to having freedom of speech? It's not just for you personally being able to say things and not having to worry. What
I think it's a class thing.
Wait,
Like everyone's allowed to have a voice, an equal voice.
Yeah. So, and most importantly, you have an equal voice relative to what, or in what area are you able to talk? Well, anyone know, generally speaking, historically, why freedom of speech became, if back in the day we didn't have freedom of speech and we had monarchs who you couldn't insult, and then somewhere along the line, cultures evolved or societies changed to have freedom of speech, why was it that they started instituting these things? Who was it that we wanted to stop? Well, there was this feeling that in the people before the freedom of speech became like a major concern of people in a society, there was this idea of like whatever the person in charge says you have to do. And then somebody realized, this is an oversimplification of course, but basically someone realized, well, what happens if the person in power isn't looking after us? What if they are trying to, violate us, the ordinary person? Well, the idea was if we are prevented from talking to each other, we're not going to be able to prevent those in power, in this case, a government, from exploiting us. So freedom of speech is not just for your own personal sort of benefits. It's also because the idea is it's only if you have freedom of speech that you can avoid having an overpowerful government that can do what it wants and take away your rights. So protect rights of people. So that's the general idea. So with freedom of speech, the reason we like it is one, just because we're able to say what we want and do what we want, or express our views and our opinions, but also there's an important bit of you need to be, if the government in power doesn't allow people with dissenting voices to disagree, then if you're a dissenter, you're probably going to be kept down and lose many of your rights. Another benefit of freedom of speech is very often you as an individual do not have the best ideas in mind. I'm sure all of you, can any of you think of a time in which you were about to do something dumb and then somebody came along and was like, wait a second, you shouldn't do that. I'm sure all of us have some experience. All too often it's our parents. But the idea here is that if you allow people with dissenting voices to disagree, if you allow someone to say the president is stupid, then it's less likely that the president is going to do something that the majority of the society or really any of the society doesn't want to have happen. So if you can't say that's a bad policy, then that bad policy might be enacted. And it's only by allowing people who disagree to speak that we're able to make these sorts of decisions and kind of put those checks and balances on those who are in a position of power. So does this all make sense? Any questions at this point? This should all sound rather familiar from like a US history class or from a government class or something like that from high school. All this sound good so far? We good? All right. If at any point you've got any questions, feel free to, I've got the chat up and everything, so feel free to go ahead. So that's freedom of speech generally. Now, it's important to just highlight a couple things about freedom of speech. The way the word is used has speech in it, but when we're talking about freedom of speech, are we only talking about speaking with our mouths, or are there other things that are protected by freedom of speech? Anyone know? So if in the United States, we have freedom of speech. Does that mean we're only allowed to say what we want? Or are we also allowed to do, write it down or draw pictures or?
I would say like expression. So like you can write it, art, music.
Yeah, freedom of speech, even though we use speech, covers more generally freedom of expression. So this means that song, you have a freedom to sing things. You could write them down. Even things like what you choose to wear, there's an element of expression that's covered by freedom of expression. So if in your culture, there's a particular type of clothing or a particular sort of garment that is closely associated with your culture, in the United States or somewhere with freedom of speech that covers this sort of thing, you're allowed to wear that sort of clothing. In another society that has less freedom of speech, you might not be allowed to wear your traditional clothing. That would be a case in which your freedom of speech is reduced. So that makes sense? How it's not just a matter of speaking, it's also a matter of expression generally. And there's also some overlap here with freedom of religion, because very often freedom of religion is the right to say and practice what you believe. So if you have freedom of speech, very often that goes hand in hand with you're allowed to preach your own religion and things like that. All right. Now, I've been talking about freedom of speech so far like it's a binary, you have it or you don't. But that's not really the case. You can think of freedom of speech as one of those things that you can have more or less of. There are ends to this. So in the same way that you could have it exists on a scale, you can think between, if we were to put arbitrary numbers, between like 0 and 100, where a 0 is you have no freedom of speech at all, and a 100 is you have complete freedom of speech. You can fall anywhere between. So in a society in which you had complete 100% freedom of speech, what would that look like? Universal.
York.
Valerie.
It would look like New York. Like we're free to like literally say and do anything.
So what you said there is almost correct. New York is going to be closer to this end of the scale, but as a matter of fact, there are, and we'll talk about them in a minute, there are limits on what you're allowed to say, even in New York City. And we'll talk about those in a minute. Yeah, Elio says we'd be at like a 90. So yeah, We'll put New York City here, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But it was the second part of what you said that is a correct answer for what is a society that is a 100. What does that look like? You can literally say anything. Then what would a 0 be? And a 0, I really like, we can imagine cases that were farther down this scale. Like if you can imagine that medieval time where if you insulted the king, you get your head chopped off. Or a communist nation like Stalin's Soviet Union, where if you insulted Stalin, you get your head chopped off or you get shot. These are cases more than around in the 10 range. So this would be a like a totalitarian dictatorship. I cannot spell totalitarian dictatorship slash absolute monarchy. But even here, there are certain things that you're allowed to say, like they weren't going to necessarily chop off your head if you just said the king wasn't the best possible king. A 0 would be some sort of sci-fi case. Did any of you have to read 1984 in high school or in one of your English classes?
Yeah.
Okay, so in 1984, they literally invent a language that makes it impossible to speak against the order of things. That would be a 0. Another one is you can imagine like if our alien overlords took over and installed brain chips that physically prevented us from saying anything against those in power, that would also be a 0. So this would be like aliens with brain chips. This is him, or whatever the alien identifies as, with his little needle to inject your brain. So that would be down at the 0. So, but as I said, the United States and New York City in particular isn't quite all the way up at 100. We said 90. And again, these numbers are just approximate. But why is it the case that we have something like New York City up here at a 90? Why isn't it at a 100? Why is it that we don't live in a society, and really no society ever has fallen at either of these incredible extremes? So why is it the case? Does anyone know, as a matter of fact, what things in the United States you actually are not allowed to say, or what circumstances you're not allowed to say them? So Elio says we worry about safety. And that's right. And the things we're talking about are safety related. Antonio.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say you can't like scream fire in like an auditorium or.
Yep, that's the classic case. You cannot scream fire in a crowded space. So if you lived in a society in which you had had the freedom to say anything, you could scream fire in a crowded space, or you could scream bomb in an airport, and there would be no punishment for that. And why, though, do we not have it? Why in the United States are we not quite at 100% free speech? Why do we prevent these things? Well, it's like Elio said, safety. What happens if you yell fire in a crowded space or yell bomb in a public place?
Chaos.
Chaos. There's going to be a stampede and people are going to get injured. So what we find is, while there's a lot of things about complete free speech that sound nice, there are certain things that even a society with extreme levels of free speech like the United States or New York City there are certain things you aren't allowed to say. So these sorts of things that are like going to cause chaos are one of them. Does anyone know what else you aren't legally allowed to say in the United States that are not protected by, you're not legally allowed to do?
Isn't it like speak deaf on the president, on the active president?
You cannot incite violence. So you're allowed to say things like, I hate this person, or this person is not somebody who deserves to be alive. That is something that would be, you'd be allowed to say that. You cannot, however, say, hey, you, and you, come with me and let's go kill somebody. That is not allowed. You're not allowed to incite violence. You're not allowed to say things that actively are designed to bring about the death of anybody, including the president. You also aren't allowed to make threats of, now the line between a threat is not always clear, but something that's clearly a threat is not something you're allowed to say. Lastly, you aren't allowed to make up things about people and publish them in and try to use lies to affect someone's what's the word I'm looking for? Reputation. You can't go and make up things about anybody, have them published, and then try to do that with the aim of lowering their popularity or their reputation. And now again, the line between just saying things off the cuff and having it officially in print and having it printed illegally, and that's called libel. So that sort of case would be another thing. So here in the United States, these are the limits we have. Now, so this is what the say anything looks like. Here's what say nothing looks like, or in the middle. And then the great ethical question, the reason we bring up free speech in the ethics class is we know that as a matter of fact, New York is here. And we know as a matter of fact, the aliens and the totalitarian dictatorships are down here. The ethical question, though, is what amount, where on the scale should we fall? Where should we look to be? And the reason we're bringing this up is because, well, different societies have given different answers to this. And what we're finding is the answer to where the correct place to fall seems to be changing. And the reason this is coming up is more and more people are starting to discuss maybe the way we've been doing it is not appropriate. Mike, not Mike, Mark, and Mike Yuan. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's really no certain answer, because let's just say if you do it in the middle, that means you're limiting speech as well. But then if you're on another spectrum, you're just still doing the same thing.
Yeah, so let's actually talk about a nation that falls somewhere closer to the middle, where it's not a totalitarian dictatorship. It falls somewhere between the 90 and 10 range. So let's put up France. France has freedom of speech in a lot of areas, but there are certain things that you are not allowed to say in France that you are allowed to say in the United States. Can anyone guess what those are, or have read certain sorts of things that freedom of expression, things that are not allowed in France that are allowed in New York? Let's go with our history here. What happened to France between the years of 1940 to 1945? History lesson.
World War II.
World War II, and specifically in France, what happened? Well, here was one big nation run by a man named Hitler, and he took over this other nation, France. So when he took over France in World War II and put a German-backed government in charge, what group of people were in charge? What is the party, or the what was Hitler's political party?
The Nazis.
The Nazis, yeah. So because of this history in France, one of the things you cannot do in France is wear, display, or sell any sort of Nazi memorabilia. So in France, you cannot wear a hat with the swastika on it, even if you had a grandparent who fought for Germany in World War II. Even if it's a family heirloom or something like that, you cannot wear it. So in France, there are Nazi symbols not allowed. There are also certain religious, did I just get blurry? Do I need to pause the, where's the camera? Stop video, start video. All right, am I unblurry now? Okay, awesome. So another thing, there are certain types of religious clothing and things like that that you cannot wear in France. So there was a big legal and cultural disagreement recently about the burkini. Are people familiar with what a burkini is? Have people heard of this? It's a swimsuit worn by Muslim women who are more orthodox that covers all the way from the top of the head, and it's basically a hood all the way down to the ankle. And it's more or less an entire body covering. In France, these were being outlawed because they were being deemed religious clothes or clothes signaling religious affiliation. And French law said that that is not something you are allowed to do. There are no outside images of a religious nature allowed to be worn. And again, that's for historical reasons. So what we find is the way the United States does it is one way. France does it a slightly different way. And the question is, which one's better? And as Mike said, like, you can understand why it would be the case that a nation like France that dealt with Nazi occupation in World War II would not want to have it be legal to display Nazi symbols. Or a nation like France, where in its history there were many, many religious wars and thousands of people of different Christian sects murdered each other, and then large numbers of Jewish people were killed both in the Holocaust and before. You can understand why these sorts of issues are kind of a hot button topic that people are going to want to avoid having conflict around. But as Mike said, there's this worry of, is it really fair to tell someone they can't wear something of their that displays their religious affiliation because of issues having to do with the history of the nation or something like that? So does everyone understand here what the issue is? And also there are other things. So what are some other things you're allowed to do in the United States or in New York City that other nations or we ourselves might want to say, look, we have freedom of speech and there's a lot of great things about it, but there's certain things that are legal in this country that we might worry are too much. You might look and say, maybe we want some of these sorts of things like France has. So does anyone know what the type of speech is that's really the real topic coming up in the news, online? The thing that people are looking at now and saying, maybe we need to reconsider our old style of doing this. Valerie?
I would say maybe hate speech.
Hate speech, exactly. So hate speech, why is my marker not working? Give me 1 second to get a different marker. Why are none of my markers working? Hate speech. So what is hate speech? And why is it that people are starting to worry more and more about hate speech and look at it as saying, maybe it's time, because of the nature of hate speech, that we need to move from our sort of New York City, and you can say just about anything that isn't a direct cause of violence, towards more of this other way? And is that sort of move, because there are many people who are saying that, is that correct? Or is it rather that this is, hate speech is just a sort of necessary byproduct and an unfortunate byproduct of the way that a properly free society has to be? And you can't get the good without the bad, but the good outweighs the bad. So what is hate speech? What is the definition of it? Anyone want to give who's familiar? I'm sure you've all heard the phrase. Or does anyone want to give an example of hate speech?
I Googled it. So it's an
Alright.
abusive or threatening speech that expresses prejudice against a particular group.
Yeah, so basically the way to think of it, what was the first word you said, Valerie?
Abusive or threatening speech.
Abusive speech against some group that displays prejudice. So yeah, the idea behind hate speech is that you are saying abusive things to someone because of the group they're in. So you say something hateful about a certain group because of the group they're in. So you say things like, people of this race are bad simply because they're members of that race, or people of this sexual orientation are so-and-so because of their sexual orientation, or people of this gender are such and such simply because of their gender. That's what we're talking about with hate speech. So hate speech is abusive speech against a group that displays prejudice. And within the United States, given, well, I haven't actually mentioned it yet, but what's the main law that protects freedom of speech in this country? Anyone know?
One of the amendments.
Yeah, it's the first one, the
Okay.
First Amendment. So it was the First Amendment to the Constitution, and it says that the government shall in no way pass a law that restricts the freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And so in the United States, because of this First Amendment rights, you are allowed to engage in hate speech legally as long as it does not pass the threshold into that other type of speech we were talking about. So long as you are not crossing the line from just abusive speech into a call to violence or abusive speech into a credible threat, as long as you're just saying people of this group are worse, or I hate people of this group, or hey, you person of this group, get out of here, you don't belong here, you're yada yada. That is in the United States, technically speaking, legal. So this is really in the United States what the question comes down to. Is the nature of hate speech and the pain it causes so bad that the First Amendment is no longer working for us? Or is it that, just like it's been the case since the beginning of our country, the First Amendment has served us well, and yes, it has allowed for hate speech, but the good it does is so much more than the bad cause that we just have to accept the certain degrees of hate speech. And so for most of our history, most people have said the First Amendment is worth it. Yes, there's hate speech, but we as a society, we don't want to do it on the French model. We don't want to tell people they can't wear certain religious clothing. We want to accept that sometimes people are going to say abusive things, but the benefit is that you're allowed to say just about anything unless you cross the realm into active threat to other people. So does all of this make sense to people so far of like what the real issue is? Because both hate speech and free speech are topics that people feel really passionately about on both sides. And it's very difficult to see how you can ensure the level of free speech that we have in this country without at the same time allowing free hate speech to exist. So that makes sense to everyone, how the idea of getting rid of hate speech, well, without getting rid of free speech is not a possibility. Yeah, okay, good. Now, when I was younger, this topic was not something that got discussed nearly as much as it is today. What has changed in the world in the past 20 years that has changed the way in which hate speech gets talked about and the amount of hate speech we talk about? So hate crimes. But what is it specifically? So hate crimes are definitely something that is happening and causes us to talk about this more. But there's a sense in which hate crimes have always taken place in this country. So if you, in your US history class, there are many stories about lynchings of Black people in the South back in the 20s and the teens and even the late 1800s. So hate crimes are definitely a thing now, but they have been a thing for a long time. So what is it that, I think you're right, that there's something about the hate crimes, or the hate crimes are tied in with hate speech in a way, but what is it that's changed in the past 20 years that has led to, if not hate crimes going up, then hate crimes being talked about more? Or maybe they are going up due to these other sorts of changes. Think back, what was not nearly as big? Say that again, Valerie.
Technology, like
technology, yeah.
media.
Yeah, so in the case of hate crimes, the main difference between today, let's go with just the case of police brutality. Let's take a case in which one particular cop is violent towards a particular person of color. I'm trying to stay out of all the things of one, let's just talk about an individual case. What is the main difference today compared to even 10 years ago? If that happens, what is the main difference?
I think, like Valerie said, in terms of technology, it's broadcasted on a global scale now.
It's broadcasted. 10 years ago, the average person did not have a super powered video recording device in their pocket. If somebody committed a crime or a cop partook in some type of brutality, it was just going to become a matter of the people who saw it would talk about it, and the cops would say one thing, they would say another thing, and that was the end of it. Nowadays, the reason these things are getting talked about more and more is because of the modern technology, because of the cell phone, because that information can spread. And so all this sort of modern technology is changing the place of hate speech and hate crimes in our society as a whole. So one thing that is happening that has changed, well, let's just talk about it. The main change has been technology. So what are some of the ways that technology has changed hate speech and hate crimes? Well, one thing it's done is now they are much harder to ignore. One of the things about human beings that we talked about this semester is how we are biased individuals. We have these cognitive biases. We have these tendencies to think in a certain way. And because of this, things that are much more emotional to us are things we're far more likely to act upon. There's a reason why people get far more upset seeing a single dead person than they do hearing about 1,000 dead people halfway around the world. Something about the visceral seeing. So in that way, modern technology has led it to be the case that we have seen the ways that hate speech and hate crimes affect communities much more than ever before, because that information is being broadcast. So that is one reason why people are beginning to talk about hate speech and the associated hate crimes in ways that they never have before, because we see it. It is much more visceral. And so people are now wondering, maybe we've been doing it wrong for years. Maybe the fact is that we just didn't know how bad it was, or we stuck our heads in the sand and we avoided these things because we could do so. And now with modern technology, we cannot. So what are some other ways in which hate speech and hate crimes have been changed by modern technology? Either be it the phone, the internet, the computer, Twitter, any of these things. Valerie.
I'm sorry. I just think maybe like more access. People have more access to like voice their opinion as opposed to receiving media from like 3 channels and just whatever they say is the news.
Ease of spreading info. So I think there's 2 elements here. One of them is kind of tied in with the much harder to ignore bit. And the much harder to ignore bit, because people can go outside of, Nick, I'm going to talk about the paper at the end of class. So I'm going to stop at 6:55 and talk about paper stuff. So it's much harder to ignore, and the ease of spreading info makes it much harder to ignore. But there's a second bit of this, which is what Elio says. This is the anonymity of the internet. So it's not just that we are seeing more hate speech and hate crimes because of the technology. It's also the case that because we're better able to talk to each other anywhere around the world, and specifically when you're typing a subtweet or when you're sending someone a direct message or tweeting at them, you do not see them and they do not see you. And what is the consequence of this? What is the case when people think they're anonymous or that no one can track them? What are they willing to do?
Anything.
Yeah, exactly. If you put a mask on someone, especially in a large group of people, it is much more likely that people are going to be willing to say hateful things. So the ease of spreading the information is one tied in with the fact that we are now for the first time seeing hate speech more because of the nature of the news, because people can post these videos. If you had a video of something like this before the internet age, you just so happen to have a video of of a hate crime taking place, you couldn't share it with everyone because you didn't have the internet. But also, for the same reason, if you want to say something hateful to a person, it is now so much easier to do it. You now just find them on Twitter and say the hateful thing. So there's also a reason the anonymity of the internet has led to more hate speech happening. let's say with just more hate speech. And that's because with the anonymity of the internet and because of the degree to which you can access people from far away, access easy to access victims, what this means is that there's an argument to be made that there's just, in terms of volume, more hate speech than ever before. And so this is one of the things people are pointing to as reasons that we need to maybe rethink things. Now, others are saying, no, we don't. And so this is why there's this issue. It's because the internet is shifting the nature of, or the volume of hate speech that we see. Now, there are other elements of modern technology that are changing hate speech. And so far we've talked about like the amount and the type, but there's also an argument to be made that hate speech is able to have larger societal effects than it has in the past. So does anyone, anyone have any ideas about what it is about the nature of the internet age that allows hate speech to impact society more generally than it did before? So one reason that the effects are worse, I think, is, oh, Mike, you have a hand. Mike, you want?
Oh, sorry. I was gonna maybe say like people are now able to find the person a bit easier.
Yeah, it's much easier to find the person. So the ease of the access is much more. And I think also a thing with this is it's not just ease to access, it's also if you're the victim, it's harder to get away. So compare bullying versus cyberbullying.
Professor,
Yeah.
would it also be like the impact? So
Yeah.
let's say everyone could see it online, so that everyone, your mom, your family, and including your friends, will be able to see it.
Yeah, so that's another thing that so another reason, so it's much harder, I think, does that fall into the much harder to ignore? But it's not just the news, it's that literally if someone says something hateful to you, your family is able to see it. If a bully was insulting you on the playground, they'd say it quietly, and then you could tell your parents, but they weren't there to see it. Now, whenever a public-facing person gets any type of hate directed at them, their entire family sees it. They see if some politician, female politician, gets a rape threat, everybody in their family is able to see this if that's public, posted online. Very often terrible things are said on Reddit or other public forums. So I think that's another element of it. But what's it, bullying versus cyberbullying? In a lot of ways, physical bullying, you know, there's physical pain, but in a lot of ways, cyberbullying can be more damaging. What is it about cyberbullying that can be so terrible? Well, for anyone who's watched those old movies with like the schoolyard bully, where do you have to be afraid of the bully? Or those of you who experienced in-person bullying as a kid, where did you have to be worried?
The playground.
Yeah, you had to be worried on the playground. Once you left the playground and went home, did you have to worry about the bully?
No.
No, you go home and you're safe there. With cyberbullying, though, you go home and what can the bully still access you? Yeah, they can continue.
Of course, yeah, through social media.
Wait, say that, Mike? Oh. Yeah, so you cut in and out there for a second. I just wanted you to repeat yourself.
So yeah, basically through social media.
Yeah, on social media, they are gonna find you and they are gonna bully you. And because all of us are so connected to the internet and we so rely on things like Twitter and Instagram for both our entertainment and our socializing, if you rely on that sort of, the only way to avoid getting cyberbullied or avoid seeing your cyberbully on Instagram is you have to go online, see that you're getting cyberbullied and then block them, or just avoid the social media platform altogether. And if you're somebody who really cares about these and has friends on Instagram or engages with your friends when you're not with them through a text-based service of some sort, you can't engage in your social life without going on the very things that you're being bullied on. And so it's impossible, as Mike said, it's easier to access your victim, but then it's even harder for the victim to get away. So if somebody's saying hateful things to you, you can't just turn the other cheek. You can't walk away, because anywhere you go, they're still insulting you from your phone. So that's another issue of it. And now here's something else that has changed thanks to the nature of the internet. And this is one of the main reasons. So you'll possibly have heard in the news that there's been a lot of discussions of various governmental organizations or groups in Congress who are looking at big tech companies and looking at possible need to reduce their power. And while a lot of this has to do with monetary concerns, another issue of it is the nature of these big tech platforms, things like Facebook and things like Google, are leading to extremism in a way because of the very nature of the internet, both because of the way these technology companies' platforms work, and then also just because of the nature of how communities form online. So think back to before an internet time. If you were a part of a community, how did you interact with people in that community? How did you find new communities to join? What did all of that involve? If you wanted to join, and say it's 1950, you want to join a new church community, how would you go about doing that?
Physically, like in person.
Yeah, you'd go there and you'd talk to people face to face, which meant what? A community seemed to be grouped very closely with physical location. Back in the day, it was very, very difficult, pretty much impossible, to join a community of people who did not live nearby you. Nowadays, what's the main way that people join communities? What are the majority of the new communities we enter? Some are job and work and school, but what are most of them?
Like forums and stuff.
Yeah, forums. So how many of you have joined some group online that you didn't know much about it, but you started getting interested, and then the next thing you know, you're checking their website all the time? It could be something on Reddit. It could be a Facebook group. It could be anything like this. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had this experience. Has anyone had, what about those, are any of you fans of sports teams that are not in New York City? Are any of you fans of any sort of, yeah, so many of us are fans and parts of communities that are not physically located in a certain place. What are the main drivers here behind these types of communities? What is the main thing that brings people together in these groups? It's not place, it's what?
Wouldn't it be like likeness, dislikeness?
Yeah, it's likeness, dislikeness, or just more common interests. So back in the day, you were basically, your community was kept to your space, and maybe you could find other people interested in what you're interested in, but it was far less likely that you were going to find a large number of people with similar views to yours. That has totally changed on the internet. If you want to become members of a group that is into bodybuilding and knitting, and what you do is you do like bench press sets and squats, and then during their off hours, you knit together, that group exists. I'm sure they exist and you can find them. If they don't, you can find other people with the same interests. Because of this, groups are becoming more and more grouped together. It's easier to find like-minded people. And now, oftentimes these sorts of communities and groups are positive things. You join up with people with similar interests, sports fans, hobby groups, but those aren't the only groups of people who find each other online. Who else groups up and finds each other online? I'll give you a clue, it's tied to this.
I was about to say Tinder, but I don't know. Those people who
So yeah,
being
so
websites.
there is sexual stuff too, but in the context of this class, what other groups of people find each other online?
Hate groups.
Yeah, hate groups. If you are the only member in your community who dislikes people of a certain race, you have nobody to talk to about it. And so whatever else happens, you aren't going to really be doing much hate speaking because there's no one else around you. There's no group of people with you. Now, though, with the internet, it is much, much easier to find other people and form these hate groups. So in the article reading for this week, it's even like the article itself is a few years old at this point. But even by that point, there were thousands of websites devoted to hate groups. And so another major change with modern technology is technology has allowed an increase in hate speech through an increase, let's see if I can actually get my marker to work, in hate. The number of hate groups has gone up because of the nature of the internet. The nature of the internet allows people with similar views to come together. And then because they're coming together in ways they've never come together before, the amount of hate speech that they can produce has gone up. Another issue with this is how many, I'm gonna erase some of these top ones. How many people have heard of, we may have talked about this earlier in the semester. Group polarization. Has anyone heard of the phrase group polarization? It's a psychological term. All right, so what is a pole? Like, what is the North Pole or the South Pole on the Earth? The North Pole is where on the Earth? Santa Claus, he lives at the North Pole. If I were to draw the Earth, where would I find him? The North. Specifically, where north? Like just the north half?
North Pole?
Yeah, where is the North Pole on our Earth?
The Northern Hemisphere, I guess.
Yeah. Where though? Like it's in the Northern Hemisphere, but where exactly? The absolute tippy top. The North Pole is the top. It is the most extreme north. So group polarization is the process that more and more people become more and more extreme in a group with similar views. So what group polarization is if you have a lot of people who share views and they're just talking amongst themselves, they begin to have even stronger views in favor of whatever it is that they were thinking originally. So you see this with sport fans all the time. You get a group of, you get a group of people together, say like fans of tomorrow's Star Wars Day, so we'll go with Star Wars. People who see Star Wars might like it a little bit. And then they start talking to other people who like Star Wars. And all of them are just discussing this over and over again. And over time, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to like Star Wars more and more and more because they're spending so much time talking about it, because it's creating this sense of, this goes back to our unit or our lesson a few weeks back. What was the in-group preference? Well, in-group preference was your tendency to like people who are in your group and to want to be a member of that in-group. So once you're in a group and you start sharing views, you start wanting to do things that make it more and more and more likely that you're in that group. So in this case, if you go into a group mildly racist and spend your time talking to other mildly racist people, over time, the group itself is going to get more and more racist, in large part because there's going to be a sense of camaraderie as you talk to other people that are like you. And then the other factor going into it, what was social proof? This was one of the social psychological principles that we discussed in that same unit. It was one of the things I asked you all on that homework assignment to look on advertisements, one of them to show social proof. What do we say the social psychological principle of social proof is? Anyone remember?
Like everyone like it.
Say that one
like
again.
That a high amount of people like a product.
Exactly. Yeah,
service.
it's this idea that the more people that think something's true, the more you think it's going to be true. So if you enter a group online of people who share a view with you, and because your online community is just going to be other people who choose to be members of that community. So if you join a hate group online and you're talking amongst people who are members of that hate group, over time, the only people you're interacting with are going to have hateful views, are going to have these sorts of views that, oh, we're only talking hateful things. Therefore, over time, you're only going to be hearing hateful things. Therefore, you're going to be more likely to think those things are true as time goes on. Does that make sense to everyone? How just a group of people who share somewhat of a view at the beginning will become more and more extreme as time goes on. So does that make sense of how the internet is, by grouping people with similar views together, allowing for extremism to increase in ways? And these are the ways when you hear on the news that there's been an increase in hate groups. These are the sorts of mechanisms that are behind it. These are the sorts of things that are causing these groups to organize and get more extreme views in a way that wasn't necessarily possible before the internet came along. One last thing. How many of you have been texting with a friend and proceeded, in the process of attempting to make a joke, to insult your friend terribly? Anyone ever done this in text or online? Me and Mike have. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah. Why is it so easy to accidentally insult your friend online? What is it about texting someone that makes it so easy when you were trying to joke, but they get deeply insulted?
Because they're not interpreting it the way you're saying it.
Exactly. When you're typing, the act of typing, all tone is lost. So tone in typing is lost. If you say something, yeah, memes are another thing where like the tone of a meme is meant to be a joke, but if you don't take it as a joke, it can be deeply insulting. And so why am I bringing this up in the context of a hate group? Well, remember that one of the things that is legal in the United States is hate speech, but what is not legal is what is generally called harm speech or threats. And now, if online people don't know your tone, one of the major issues that comes up is the line between hate and harm speech is much less clear than it was before the internet age.
Ну, пойдем покушаем после этого, потому что я после 8 не могу есть. Мне надо будет после этого срочно побежать куда-то поесть.
Ну, как скажешь, ну, давай закончим тогда.
Все, мы уже 10 минут от адреса. Все, мне дилер звонит.
All right. I just found out how to mute people. That's a useful thing. All right. So hate versus harm speech. So if you are in a online forum, the line between hate speech and harm speech is much less clear. So very often, what ends up happening is that what the person might be, one person might type up hate speech on the internet, or what they think is merely hate speech, but somebody else might then read that and think it's a call to arms. And so you might see someone who says people of this group aren't worthy of living, and they might be, that would technically speaking be hate speech. However, if somebody reads that and thinks of it as saying, we need to kill all the people of this race or this religious group, then this hate speech, because the person reading it doesn't know the tone, doesn't know the context, and can take it much more extreme than would typically be the case, what ends up happening is that these people end up being brought to do violence on the basis of things that in the past might not have, if spoken in person, it may have been clear it wasn't intended in the way that this person took it. So these are the sorts of cases or the sorts of issues that come up. And these are the sorts of concerns surrounding why people are starting to question whether in the United States we need different laws, or whether we need to at least reconsider how we deal with hate speech online. Because the fact is, it's a changing game. So out of curiosity, and if you find this topic interesting, the third paper prompt is on exactly this. Imagine a case in which somebody starts a website, should it be like a hate group website, should it be legal or should it be illegal? And so whether or not this is going to become illegal is a different question. And I mean, I see both sides of it. I see the need to protect free speech in this country. And I see the worries about people, especially in minority groups, who are facing hate speech and the ways in which hate speech can turn into harm speech. What are people's, does anyone have a view at this point about what they think the issue is? Or I mean, what they think the best solution to this sort of thing is? I know Mike said that it's a complex issue, which is for sure the case. Does anyone else have anything they want to add on the what should be done given the nature of the internet? Whether, is it just the case that we need to, you know, find new ways of, or new laws around the internet, or should we just keep going as we are and find other ways to solve these problems? So Mike says there is no solution. But here's the question though, is as a matter of fact, there kind of has been in our society a move towards solving this problem, which is the government has not imposed laws on hate speech online, but there has actually been certain sorts of, I guess, community-wide practices that have shifted thanks to the internet, and things are happening now that didn't happen before. So these days, if a celebrity says something hateful online, what typically happens to them? If a celebrity says a certain group of people is less, what often happens, Valerie?
Oh, they get canceled.
Yeah, cancel culture. So here's another worry about if we, so yeah, we have this issue where because there's no laws in place, what is often happening now is cancel culture is stepping in. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, cancel culture is this practice of the public or large companies removing their support of somebody on the basis of what this person said or did. And so, for instance, if somebody comes out and posts something on Twitter that the population deems unacceptable, they might lose. So recent one was an actor in the Star Wars show, The Mandalorian, who had her job with Disney, her contract with Disney torn up because she said some things that Disney deemed unacceptable and inappropriate. So she was canceled. So because there's no laws around this, but people are getting very upset and people are getting hurt and people are truly unhappy, what is happening is there's been this weird vacuum that has been created, and instead cancel culture is stepping in. And there's a lot of worries around it being cancel culture, because in the United States, if you break a law, what happens? If you say are accused of murder, you say you didn't do it, they say you did, what happens? Where do you go? Come on, accused of murder, but you say you didn't do it. Where are you gonna end up?
Oh, you go to jail.
You're gonna go to jail, but then what'll happen afterwards, Antonio?
So I'll say you're gonna end in the bookends.
Yeah, and then, but eventually, ideally, again, no, our country's not perfect on this. Eventually, where are you gonna end up? Who are you gonna end up sitting in front of if you're accused of murder?
Judge.
A judge and a jury, at least in theory. And a judge and a jury, at least in theory, is designed to give you a unbiased sort of opinion, or at least give you a somewhat objective opinion. Cancel culture is, there is no judicial process. If somebody decides that this person needs to be canceled, then you don't really have any way of protecting yourself. So there's this strange thing in which, because there's this vacuum surrounding hate speech, what's ended up happening is other ways that are even in some ways harsher than the judicial system and much less accurate are stepping in and creating problems of their own. All right, I said I would go to 6:55 and then talk to papers and business. But does anyone have any questions about this freedom of speech, hate speech stuff? The main thing I wanted to do today was just go over some of the general facts around hate speech, some of the new technological issues, so that if this is a topic that interests you, you've got the background to go and write your paper on it. So any questions on the free speech, hate speech sort of questions at this point? All right, if no questions, let's talk papers. All right, so let's put up some dates. May 3, May 10, May 17. All right, so these are our last 3 classes. This is today. Now, next class, you are going to, these final 2 classes, we're going to be discussing papers and how to write them. Basically, I know many of you, this is your first philosophy class, and nothing is more terrifying than a professor saying, here, go write a paper, and you feeling like you don't know what they're looking for. So because of this, I'm going to spend the next couple classes, as well as a bonus video that's going to go up on the 5th, Wednesday, talking about what it is that I'm looking for in a paper. What are the things I care about? How I think that for a paper like this, you should approach it. Why I think this is a skill that is worth your time and carries on outside of a philosophy class. So if you consider yourself somebody who's horrible at writing, or it's scary for you to write because you don't feel like you're good at it, the goal of the next 2 weeks is going to be to make sure that it is as, I'm not going to say pleasant, but is the lowest amount of unpleasantness possible. So what that means is that I'm going to record this video on Wednesday. I'm going to be recording an extra lecture that is going to just be the full background of why I think papers are worth doing and how I think you should go about thinking of writing this paper. Nothing practical yet, nothing really focused, just more like, why on earth am I asking you to write a paper, and why do I think it's worth doing, and how do I think it might actually help you? So it doesn't feel like you're just, pulling teeth, stabbing yourself, whatever other painful metaphor. So that'll be bonus video. Also in that bonus video, I'm going to talk about the first step to writing one of these papers, which is a thesis. And on next Monday, you're going to have a thesis assignment due. Now, what is the thesis assignment? Well, the thesis assignment is posted on the Blackboard, and basically what it is this. I've provided you all with 3 paper prompts. These 3 paper prompts are rather long and in-depth and are designed to give you an option of different things to write on. Ultimately, you're only going to be writing on one of the 3 paper prompts. So what I want you to do, though, is start engaging with the paper prompts by thinking about what the theses would be. So the paper prompts, one of them's about a trolley problem type case. One of them's about cultural relativism. One of them's about hate speech, especially in the context of the internet. And so what you're going to be doing is reading over these 3 prompts, and just what your assignment will be you writing out what the 6 possible theses you could argue for in your paper. So each assignment is going to have each prompt will have one thing that's being argued about. The first one is basically should you shoot your best friend to save 1,000 people, or should you not shoot your best friend? The second one is, imagine this violent alien culture. Should we judge them, or should we not judge them? The third one is going to be about, imagine somebody starts a neo-Nazi website. Should it be illegal, or should it not be illegal? And so those are, given that those 3 topics, you have 6 possible theses you could write your final paper on. I want you to practice writing theses. So what does this mean in practice? Well, imagine that the paper prompt came up with, this is an imaginary paper prompt, this is not one of the 3. So what are better, cats or dogs? So if this was the prompt of the paper, you would have 2 possible theses you could argue for here. What would they be? What would a thesis be? Or what are the 2 sides to this argument? Because a thesis is just what you're ultimately arguing for. So if the question is what are better, cats or dogs, what are your 2 possible theses?
Cats are better or dogs are better.
Exactly. So what I'm asking you for the assignment for Monday is, there would be 3 of these, but I would literally just be asking you to write out like this. So possible thesis 1, in this paper, I will argue that cats are better than dogs. And then possible thesis 2 would be the exact same thing, but dogs are better than cats. And so that's all I want you to do is just practice, because theses are, if you, we often tend to overthink them, and also don't think of them until the night before papers due. So what I want to do is about 2 weeks before the papers due, make sure that you've all seen what the prompts are and thought about what the possible theses are, because ultimately you'll just be writing on one, but a good way to practice is to write out all of them. And so this assignment for next Monday it's graded pass fail. If you do it, and you are going to pass, just as long as you are making a valiant effort at finding these theses. And this is going to be a good way to practice how to begin writing an argumentative paper. And so in the video I post on Wednesday, it's going to be me talking a little bit more about theses, and then a bit more about how to write, how to begin writing a paper and what the point of papers are. Then next week, I will then start discussing the next steps in the paper. How you go from a thesis into coming up with an outline for the paper. And then the final class will be talking about how to turn that outline into a full-blown paper with paragraphs and everything else. So for the next 3 weeks, it's going to be, or I guess the next 2 weeks, since we end the next 2 classes, you have a video to watch on Wednesday and this short thesis assignment due next Monday. Then next week, I'm going to want you to write up an outline for your paper, what that's supposed to look like and all. We will talk about more come next class. And then the final class, we'll talk about how to turn that outline into a final paper so that you can turn it in on the day it's due. So any questions about that game plan? We have 2 minutes left for anyone who has any questions about any of this. If at any point you have any questions about any of the assignments, just reach out to me. If you want to bounce ideas off of me about the paper, feel free. Did you have homework last week? No, it was just watch the bonus video that covered the end of the cultural relativism stuff, because we didn't get to cover all of it in class, so there was a little bonus video.
So Professor, so
Yeah.
for Wednesday, you're going to post a video talking more about thesis formation and
Mhm.
we have a homework assignment, even though there's 3 prompts and we're eventually only writing on 1, we're going to write six thesis just to prepare ourselves, right?
Exactly, that is spot on. And honestly, it's not just like, don't overthink this. Your assignment, I'm looking for 6 sentences. If you want to write a 2-sentence thesis, you can, but generally speaking, it's clearer and better if you just have a single sentence for your thesis. So yes, next Monday, and it's not due like at the beginning of the day, it's literally just get it to me before class time so that you've thought about it before we get into class. I just am looking for an assignment posted to the Blackboard. The link, the assignment sheet are all up, in which you just provide me with 6 sentences. So that's all I'm looking for. And it's to force you to read over the prompts before that. All right, any other questions on this?
So 6 sentences, not 6 possible theses.
Well, 6 possible theses are going to be 6 sentences. Each possible thesis is 1 sentence each. So 6 times 1. So there are 6 possible theses that you could have on this prompt. Well, there's 3 prompts. Each prompt has 2 sides you could argue for. So that's a total of 6 possible theses. And each thesis is just going to be 1 sentence long.
Okay,
Yep.
got it.
Any other questions? We have reached time. If nobody else has anything, again, if you have any questions about the thesis assignment, just reach out and I will send you that bonus video or I will post the bonus video on Wednesday along with this video from today. Any last questions, comments, concerns? All right. In that case, I'm going to stop the recording and tell you all have a good rest of your evening and keep your eye out for that recording on Wednesday.